Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa could face a legal challenge over concerns around the establishment, structure and function of the National Command Council on COVID-19. Advocates Nazir Kasim and Erin Richards wrote to the President seeking clarity on the possible violation of the democratic and constitutional rights of people. Now, they're concerned about the potential the Command Council has to abuse state power because there's no clear information on what it has. For more on this now, we're joined by Advocate Erin Richards, who joins us now. My understanding is via the Skype line. So, Advocate, thanks very much for your time. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. Perhaps we should start by getting an idea of the contents of this letter that you have, I guess, co-authored to the President. Give us an idea of some of the issues that you're raising there.
In substance, that letter is quite straightforward. We as lawyers noticed that there was just no information on the National Command Council. We heard ad nauseum about this body, about the decisions that it was taking, but when I started to look for information about the Command Council, I couldn't find it. I had to rely on Barry Bateman, who eventually sourced a tweet off of government's official webpage. And that was the only information that I could find about this body. And that made me raise some serious questions. The decisions around how this pandemic is governed are supposed to be made by the entire cabinet. And we find it perplexing that this Command Council consists of only 19 ministers, which is not the entire cabinet. And we can see no constitutional or statutory basis for the existence of this body. Let alone for the powers that it's exercising. And what's more worrying is that the threshold keeps moving. You know, on day one, they're making certain decisions. The next day, they're making different decisions. The next day, they seem to be an advisory body. So there's just absolutely no clarity and no transparency about this body of 19 ministers who, for all intents and purposes, seems to be running the country. So that letter just asks for clarity.
Right. And, you know, often we heard the Disaster Management Act being thrown around as the legal basis for many of the decisions and subsequent regulations that come from the National Command Council. Are you suggesting to us that there actually isn't like any piece of legislation that gives provision for the establishment of this body to begin with?
Not in our view. We cannot find a piece of legislation, it's definitely not in the DMA, and we can't find any other piece of legislation that would enable the functioning of a body like this. I think it's important to understand that there is a difference. If the NCC is simply advising, it would be less of a problem. Because the President can then say, look, thanks for your advice, but no. Or the Cabinet can say, thanks for your advice, but no. But what we are being told in express words by the President is that this body is making decisions. It's making decisions about regulations. It's making decisions about policy. And for it to do that, it must have a legislative basis. It must have a constitutional basis. And we have not been able to find one to date. So if it exists, it would be great if they could tell us.
Hypothetically speaking, though, say it is an advisory body, but Cabinet doesn't really decide to push back against any of their decisions. What difference would that make, if any?
Well, I highly doubt that would be the scenario. I mean, in law, it would be one of two things. The body's either making decisions or it's not. And that we'll have to wait for the answer.
You know, I guess part of the concerns that have been raised are sort of being communicated in terms that might be difficult for ordinary South Africans to understand. So there's a speaking about, you know, displacing constitutional and statutory functionaries. If that rings any bells to you, can you give us an idea of what you mean by that?
Well, we live in a constitutional democracy, and a very big part of that constitutional democracy is that Parliament must scrutinize the executive. So what that means is that Parliament must oversee the lawfulness, the rationality of the decisions that are made by the President and his cabinet of 28 ministers. So, for example, let's just put it into simple terms. So, for example, when the decision was taken to lock down the country, right? Parliament should be able to scrutinize that decision. They should be able to say to the President and Cabinet, give us the actual reasons why you did this. Give us the actual information on which you based this decision so we can scrutinize and we can work out, is it rational? Does it make sense? Is it lawful? But what has happened is by basically centralizing the full cabinet into the strange body of 19 people, they've effectively sidelined Parliament. Parliament is struggling to exercise its functions and to exercise oversight. So what is happening is it appears to us that we have opened the door to possible abuses of power, that we can't scrutinize and we can't check.
And I guess, we haven't really been here before, so I imagine there isn't really precedent that's been set. I mean, have we ever dealt in any way in the country with a body that's been established to deal with a huge crisis that ended up having to make very important decisions? I mean, have we been here before, is essentially my question, as far as you know?
No. So we certainly have not been exactly here before. We have had matters where the president has been declared in violation of his constitutional duties. We have had court cases, many of them where ministers have the regulations that ministers have promulgated have been found to be irrational and unlawful. So it's not like challenging government is anything new, but the scope of what is happening here and the realities of what is happening here is very novel, and obviously that also impacts us as lawyers. Even within the profession, there is some uncertainty about, for example, whether we should be in a state of disaster or a state of emergency. So there is a lot of debate, but all of that debate doesn't detract from the fact that government must act lawfully and they must give us as citizens information. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Given the novelty of the situation then, do you perhaps imagine a situation where the courts are much more understanding for any possible oversights that might have taken place before we got here?
Well, I don't. It's difficult to answer. I would certainly hope not. If indeed it is found that the NCC was unlawfully constituted and it does not have a legal basis, then I would be very surprised if the courts took a soft stance. The courts must apply the law. So if it turns out that one of our main decision-making bodies is acting what we call ultra vires, which means without legal authority, or unlawfully, if that can be proved and shown, then I do not see a court backing away from that.
Yeah. Give us an understanding then of what the consequence it might be, especially for the decisions that have already been taken until this point. I mean, if we find that the council itself is illegitimate, does it make all their decisions until this point illegitimate too? And if that's the case, what does it mean for the lockdown?
Well, it's a very interesting and very profound question, and there have been a lot of discussions between what is now quite a big legal team about precisely this question. We are going to confine what we are asking for just to the status of the National Command Council. So we just want to know from the court, is the Command Council lawful or is it not? We are confining our case to that. We are not going beyond that to question the rationality of the regulations. If court were to find that it is not the scope of our case.
Terribly sorry to have to barge in there, Erin. We are sadly losing our connection to you, and I imagine it's such an important detail you're giving us. But I guess we're going to have to leave it there, at least for now. We appreciate already what you've shared with us. Certainly a lot to think about as we enter even a new phase of the lockdown period here in South Africa. Now, Erin Richards is one of the lawyers seeking clarity around the legality of the National Command Council. Thanks very much indeed for your time.